Hello, this is Theresa Woldstad, and this is part 3 of 3 on a lecture series talking about Alaska Native art, permitting, regulatory theory, and artistic intent and modification. Today, we're actually going to be focusing on the latter, which is artistic intent and modification, and how it actually pertains to regulatory and permitting for Native arts. And this is always kind of an interesting aspect when we start talking about artistic intent and then the degree of modification required to actually create Native arts. So first off, what is creative intent? So the creative intent can be an object or an idea that inspires artistic creation. That intent can be beaded mittens for your mother as a creation of personal regalia, or it could be creative intent as economically driven by creating native handicrafts for the art market. So there is distinction in such between making it for personal use, making it for the art market, and even just being able to make it for learning and expertise. A lot of times, if you're trying to perfect your artwork, you're making art in the sake of creation, and thus you can perfect your art form. So there's a variety of different styles when we talk about in creative intent. So of course, it's like, well, why does this matter? Why does the intent matter for artistic creation? Well, the big thing is natural resources managers draw a distinction between the harvest of natural resources for personal use and commercial products. So when you're going out and gathering these natural materials, they'll actually have different uses and permitting based on whether or not you're going to create art for personal use as compared to commercial products. So the creative intent can also drive and determine available harvest locations, species that are available for your artwork, licenses and permits that are going to be required, and even the degree of artistic modification that is required to create the artwork itself. So it's kind of interesting when you start thinking of the first idea of creative intent is your first step towards regulatory permit theory for native arts. It determines so much of regulations, permitting, species, license, finding commercial use. So when you're looking at federal managers, commercial use on federal agencies is the harvest and use primarily purpose for resale, sale, or use in manufacturing process, resulting in a product that will be sold or even used for business activities. So I mention and emphasize use for business activities. If you make an object that isn't directly sold, but it's your logo, that is used for business activities. So even the sale of the object itself can actually determine commercial use, or the use of the image itself can be determined as commercial use. So it's always important to look at that. Now, the other area is research collections. And those are research collections that are directed at the development of commercial products. So they're also treated as commercial use. So if you're collecting a lot of materials that you're trying to determine whether or not it's good to actually make baskets from, specifically from this one area, to see if this is a good location for harvesting for commercial artwork in the future or a new harvest location, depending on how you phrase that into permit, it will be considered commercial use, even though you're only looking at the area. If you're intending to research the area, intending to actually make eventual commercial products or commercial art from that area, it will be considered commercial. So language is always important when you can look at these permits. Now, there is a big distinction with the federal government when it comes to barter and trade and then commercial artwork. So barter is the exchange of handicrafts or fish and wildlife parts for food or non-edible items other than money. So you can barter native art materials. You can also do customary trade, which is the exchange of handicrafts or furs for cash to support a personal use or family needs. It does not include trade that constitutes a significant commercial enterprise. So in this aspect here, if you're a rural resident and you're under subsistence management, you have the ability to do barter or customary trade for these materials that is not considered commercial use per se, but it's considered subsistence because it's part of barter and customary exchange. The key factor is it's not a significant commercial enterprise, so it cannot be your sole income. And that's where the distinction with commercial kind of gets a little sticky when you're talking about federal agencies, when you're bringing in subsistence, because with subsistence, they do allow for artistic barter and artistic trade. The key thing in again is looking at how much of your income is actually developed from that purchase or from the customary exchange. So of course, we're looking at federal commercial, but let's look at federal non-commercial uses. Now, those are actually further subdivided just to get more complicated. So personal use, of course, is divided into subsistence use. I mentioned it previously with customary and traditional uses. That can be directly personal use, family use, bartering or sharing, or customary trade. So that's the primary one. And that's the one that has the highest priority for federal management. If limited resources are available, subsistence use has the primary use. And again, you can utilize that for commercial trade and barter. The second one is personal use. This is the gathering of small quantities of materials for personal or family use that is not intended for the sale or resale. This is something you're making for yourself, something that you're making for your immediate family. So it includes cultural and traditional uses, but the key here is distinguishing between subsistence. So this is for non-rural residents. If you live in an urban area, you are not a subsistence user and you cannot use for customary and traditional uses by customary trade or barter. If it's personal use and you live in an urban area, you cannot barter or sell any of that stuff under that limited restrictions. So people of Anchorage and Fairbanks, you need to really make sure that what you're utilizing it is going to be personal use. Now, when you're looking at other non-commercial uses, they have a distinction again by collections of non-commercial entities. So let's say you're having a workshop and you want to be able to actually look at trying to do education. That educational use, when you're using a workshop or so affiliated with a college, university, or tribe, is considered an other non-commercial use. So you can get a permit to be able to go out and harvest natural resource materials to be able to teach a class for that traditional artistic style. So going out to gather spruce roots, teaching the harvesting techniques, and actually teaching the basketry weaving itself. Now, it's not commercial because they do recognize a lot of these artists are not being paid, or you're actually focusing on the non-commercial aspects of it. The key takeaway here is it's not directed towards the development of commercial product. And that's the key takeaway from there. If you're with a tribe, if you're with a class, if you're a university, or even any kind of college, remember, it's got to be not focused on a commercial product. So you're not training people to become commercial artists to make commercial products. You're training the art form. And that's the main distinguishing act of that, where you have the subsistence use, the personal use, and then the non-other commercial use. So again, we mentioned a little bit about the federal. So how does state define this? And again, we have that distinction between the state and the feds when we start talking about subsistence. Alaska's Constitution, again, emphasizes the fact that everybody has equal access to the natural resources. It's in the state constitution, and that makes the main distinguishing qualifications between federal and state. So the state actually has more of a streamlined definition between commercial and general personal use and subsistence. For commercial use, natural artistic products are harvested primarily for the sale, resale, use, and manufacturing process that results in a product that can actually be sold. And very similar to the feds, they also include things that are being utilized for business activities. So if you make a basket that's specifically your logo, and that is your main logo aspect, it is a commercial activity, thus it is commercial itself. Now they have general harvest, personal use, and subsistence. This is where it gets a little interesting because they make the distinction between botanical materials and fish and wildlife materials. They are managed by two different entities. Again, remember back in the past lecture when I started talking about Alaska Department of Natural Resources and Alaska Department of Fish and Game. They manage different things and thus they manage them differently. So for botanical materials, personal use harvest is defined by reasonable quantities for individual use. Additional harvests may require additional permitting and such, but it's based on the quantity and what's going on in that area for individual personal use. Fish and wildlife, the state manages general hunting, sport fishing, and subsistence. Now, when you're going in and harvesting fish and wildlife, they bin you into those general sections. So you have the general hunt, the sport fishing, and the general subsistence. And that includes customary and traditional harvest. The limitation regarding the creative intent then is basically based on species dependent. So the handicrafts may require different significant modifications for commercial artists compared to personal artwork based on the individual species. So compared to the feds, the state really is more driven on what you want to use as a species and then how you're going to use it. That will dictate how you're able to actually make the native artwork itself. So it sounds silly, but they are very distinct areas. And remember, they're all together in one state. So you have to make sure you're able following them no matter where you go on the general jurisdiction lines. But that's not to say that there isn't exceptions to the rules. There are cultural educational permits that are actually made by the state of Alaska. Now, this is very unique, where it authorizes the take of game for purposes of passing on cultural knowledge and tradition in a structured educational setting. So those ones are very important because they're allowing for the traditional passing of traditional art forms. The permit is non-transferable, it's no cost whatsoever, and the focus is on educational purposes as compared to nutritional. I emphasize that because most of these things deal with fish and wildlife. So rather than looking at eating the animal, the purpose is cultural education itself. So these species are generally limited to deer, moose, caribou, black bear, mountain goats, small game, and fur bears. So you can get these cultural educational permits that allow the individual to actually hold classes to teach very important educational aspects of cultural bearing. So you can go out and actually have a class on learning how to harvest mountain goat wool, looking at the mountain goat wool, and be able to actually figure out how to do thigh spinning from traditional mountain goat wool. The federal agencies also have something similar. It's called the special harvest permits. Now, the National Park Service does allow subsistence harvest under a NILCA on restricted federal lands based on the creative intent of the artwork. So in general, the national park doesn't allow you to go and hunt animals on their national park lands. But under a NILCA, they do allow it based on the intent. So the intent, again, is personal use for educational and assisting with other aspects. Or if you're from that particular park area and it is for personal cultural expression, they do allow some of those. Now, these special harvest permits for the Federal Subsistence Board, that's the key thing here, is they're authorized by the Federal Subsistence Board for the taking of game for traditional cultural education or cultural programs. So you can have cultural education programs or just a cultural program itself. A cultural program can be a stick dance or such, or some mortuary aspects, or even celebration down in Southeast Alaska. Or it can be specifically for an educational project through the tribe or even the university itself. So when I did mention that there was differences between the state and the federal, again, when you're looking at trying to teach Alaska Native artworks in their forms, both the state and the Fed have different permits that are allowing for continuation of cultural education for the art forms themselves. Again, it's always best to talk with the land managers themselves to see what's available, and then also getting ideas. A lot of times they'll also direct them to go and harvest under the general harvest or even under some of the special use or even personal use harvests. But if you need something in addition that is specific to an area, such as the best time for mountain goat wool, oddly enough, is during the spring and such, they can allow for some of those harvests. An example of that, of course, is the mountain goat robe that you see here on the side. This is Mountain Goat Robe DNA robe, and that is by Terry Rockford. She's Tlingit, and she was one of the instrumental artists who actually helped found the spring goat special harvest permit for the Sitka tribe. And that was permitted through the Sitka tribe itself for spinning and weaving in ceremonial robes. So I mentioned a lot of the permits and such, but another aspect that kind of goes into art is, when do you take the materials and how far do you take it until it becomes officially art? From raw material to art. Well, apparently that's regulated too under federal and state law. And yes, it gets complicated because artistic modification is used from everything from Marine Mammal Protection Act to bald eagles to everything along the lines, including cedar bark. So what is significantly modified? So both state and federal agencies make the distinction between native arts and native handicrafts. That's the key here, is one is arts, one is handicrafts, and they're permitted differently. So the most definitions of native handicrafts references significant alteration of the natural materials. That degree of modification is referenced in CITES and Marine Mammal Protection Act, and even several definitions on the federal for native handicrafts. So when they're talking about processing a material to be able to utilize it for commercial endeavors, a lot of times they use the word handicraft. That handicraft means significant altercation and modification. That's different from native arts. Native arts usually is referring to a wider degree of materials. So you can actually do minimalist native arts. Native handicrafts implies a significant degree of modification. So when you're looking at things, artists must consider the extent of the modification of the raw natural resources to create artwork. One is more broadly defined, native arts, but it's more focused on allowing individuals for personal use. But when you go into handicrafts, then it's more allowed for commercial use. So I did mention Marine Mammal Protection Act. That's where most artists are introduced to degrees of modification required because they're very stringent on this. So when you're looking at how they define degrees of modification, it has to be composed wholly or insignificantly of natural materials. Then the handicraft must be produced, decorated, and fashioned in the exercise of traditional native handicrafts without the use of commercial multiple carvers or mass copying devices. The improved methods of production utilizing modern implements such as sewing machines can actually be utilized, but that's more of registered tanneries so long as no large-scale mass production in the industry is occurring for it. So you can go to a tannery for hides and such to be able to process such through tanning, but in general, it has to be done by the artist traditionally, individually. So they don't really limit the techniques though. So you can have everything from weaving, carving, stitching, sewing, lacing, beading, drawing, painting, a variety of different things. The key aspect here is you have to use natural materials when you're talking, including marine mammals. You have to make sure it is done by hand, no mass copying devices, and it has to be done by a native who is basically within the blood quantum. So, and it's got to be significantly modified. So significantly altered from its natural state. What does that actually mean? In a general rule, significantly altered means that it cannot be easily converted back to its natural state. So it sounds silly, but they actually utilize that, especially when you're looking at getting those permits through CITES to transport your art outside the state of Alaska. They specifically look whether or not it could ever go back to its raw natural form. So that's the key when you're looking at figuring out whether or not it's significantly modified, is whether or not it could be easily converted back to its natural state. So if you're going to be doing scrimshaw on an ivory tusk, you need to dig it in deep. If you can basically sand that nice work off and a little of the ink, it's not considered significantly modified. You have to dig it down deep. Blankets and scarves that are utilizing a full fur backing, it has to be blocked, lined, stitched on all the edges. So it's got to be a full-on pillow or a full-on blanket. You can't just have a hide that's basically done in a square. It has to be converted into something that is harder to actually revert back to the hide. Mittens, hats, zippers, and other things have to be converted and cut into small pieces and then sewn back together. So yeah, you can Frankenstein a blanket back together, but that's not easily convertible back into a hide. So again, if it's cut into small little pieces and restitched and such to make a mitten or such, they're not assuming that you could take it all apart and whatnot. That's the key there. When you're looking at skulls, it's got to have physical carvings or scrimshaws that are deep enough that you can't just go through and sand it off. Same thing applies to ivory tusks, and then also carve bone and ivory that's been significantly altered from its natural shape. Now, this piece over on the side over here was done by Ron Sinagatuk, a Nupiaq carver. And what's really nice is it's this beautiful lamp. And you can see the traditional ivory form there. It's not altered from its natural shape. The key thing here is it was done in 1952 before Marine Mammal Protection Act. So if you have something like this and you want to make sure you can actually go through and take it through the border and whatnot, you're going to have to do some ivory scrimshaw on this. You're going to have to dig in a little further and you're going to have to be able to go through and carve that. So if you made this now, you're going to have to make sure that lamp cannot be converted. And that means you can remove the top and you can remove the bottom and then you still have the natural form. You're going to have to go further than what your other people have done prior to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And that is the distinguishing part that you need to look at. They're beautiful pieces, but today's artists need to go further with the creation. Now, this is a beautiful piece that I found. It's called the Yupik seal bag, but it was created in, they think, between 1905 and 1916, and it was around the Kuskokwim River. And it's just a traditional seal poke bag. It literally is just a giant seal that they cut, did front edges in the area, and then made a pouch. It's beautiful, and this is an example of traditional Native art. It's not really significantly modified. So there's a difference when you start saying, oh, it's traditional artwork. Traditional artwork does not mean significantly modified, and it doesn't always necessarily meet the definitions of the new treaties. So we have beautiful examples of traditional art forms, but the regulations and laws dictate going a bit further. So you're going to have to, for this particular area, go through and line the different areas. You have to make sure it can't be converted into something that can be seen as its authentic traditional peel, or its traditional authentic form. So we talked a little bit about general subsistence and the handicraft, but when you start looking at federal subsistence management for public lands in Alaska, they really start focusing on handicrafts and how they actually look at handicrafts as a subsistence aspect of livelihood. And this is all mapped out in quite a few federal laws, including public lands in the state of Alaska. So subsistence is including the creation and sale of handicrafts. And they're often referred to, and again, I'm using quotes, inedible byproducts of subsistence. So they're looking at the materials of going out and hunting and gathering materials for food, and then you have leftover bits that people make into art. And that's what a lot of these regulations are defining, is that the main aspect is subsistence for food, but also utilization of their inedible byproducts. You see this reported over and over in a lot of federal laws when they're talking about general subsistence and permitting. Is a distinction of inedible byproducts of subsistence that it's allowing them to utilize. So subsistence handicrafts is defined as a finished product made by a rural resident in Alaska of natural non-edible byproducts that's composed wholly or in some significant aspect of natural materials. The shape and appearance of those natural materials must be substantially changed by skillful use of hands. So you have to go out of your way with your own hands itself to substantially change the form. The natural material must be incorporated into a work of art that can be either traditional or contemporary design. So they're not limiting on traditional or contemporary styles, but it must be substantially greater with the monetary value and the aesthetic value than the unaltered natural material alone. Now that gets a little tricky when you start thinking about how much is a beautiful piece of ivory worth? Then how do you make it more valuable? And that's the job of the artist. You have to make sure that the monetary value of the material that you make is thus more than the original material. And that really depends on the skillful hand of the artist. And that gets tricky when you basically are first making your stuff. I hate to say this, but most artists, when you first start out, you're not going to make wonderful, beautiful artwork. You're going to learn. You're going to make mistakes. But the greater monetary aesthetic value that you need to add to that piece is going to be something that's developed over time in practice. And that's what they're starting to define, is that skillful use of hands, which kind of gets kind of sticky and gray when you're trying to define that, especially in the artistic world, and especially in different art movements where people actually appreciate the natural raw materials. So how does this differ from the state of Alaska? Because again, state and federal are different. The state of Alaska's definition of authentic Alaska Native art is very broad. But again, they say native art, not native handicraft. Authentic Alaska Native artworks are just artworks that are created in the state by Alaska Native person. That includes silver hand, and even under some of the statutes themselves are defining what works of art are. And this piece over here that you can actually see done by Larry Beck, it just has feathers, but everything else is metallic and other things he found around those areas. It's a beautiful piece, but it includes plastic, it includes mirrors, metal items and such. It's not dedicated specifically to natural materials. You can have some natural materials, but it's not composed wholly of natural materials. So that's the purpose of the state definitions, is they're trying to make it as broad as possible, especially for a lot of contemporary Native artists that are utilizing non-traditional materials for the creation of it. So when they started working on the definition of it, they included everything from calligraphy to clay to textile, the fiber, the wood, plastic, glass, or even any combination. They do establish traditional Alaska materials, and they define them as ivory, bone, grass, baleen, animal skins, wood, or furs, or any combination, anything along those lines. So the state of Alaska, when they're defining Alaska Native art, is purposely broad because they're trying to make sure people are included when they're looking at just personal use, not commercial, but personal and commercial, and as broad as possible. But this comes into the distinguishing aspects when you're going into big game trophies and fur bears. Remember how we mentioned that the state actually manages it more on species? Well, this is where it starts to apply a degree of modification. Big game trophies, you cannot sell, barter, or advertise big game trophies, including any part of the big game animal. It prohibits the sale of the artwork that is a lifelike representation using any part of a big game animal. You cannot barter or sell a big game animal skull except a black bear, wolf, or wolverine skulls. Handicrafts made from these art forms that are from big games have to be significantly altered in a manner that cannot easily be converted back to its natural state. So you can actually utilize materials from some of these big game animals, but the key here is handicrafts have to be significantly altered, and they cannot be going back to its natural state, and it cannot be a lifelike representation of any big game animal. That would be a trophy. This is distinct as compared to fur bears. Fur bears require most pelts to remain sealed until tanned, but once they're sealed, you can buy and barter and whatnot with the sealed hide. You cannot sell any raw land otter, lynx, wolf, or wolverine pelts, but artists don't need trapping or fur bearer dealing licenses to buy raw fur for personal use. You can go out and actually barter and sell and buy those materials. However, if you buy, barter, or resell animal skins, then you're going to need a fur dealer license and such. So if the point is to go buy a fur and then resell it, you're going to have to go through and actually get a fur dealer license. If you're going out and buying fur for personal use per se that is raw, then you can actually go out and do so. But again, it's that conversion into handicrafts where it's significantly modified again. A good example of this distinction and such here is actually from my own collection. One side you actually have commercial artwork that's called beaver bag, and then over on the other side you have the personal use artwork that's black bear bag. Now you can obviously tell one uses a trophy animal, which is the black bear, and the other actually utilizes a fur bear, which is a beaver. So they're pretty much along the same slide. The only difference right there is when you look at the personal use artwork of the black bear bag, you can note the claws are still on the actual fur that makes up that black bear bag. Because the claws are still attached to the actual animal, it is considered a lifelike representation, and thus it is considered a trophy, and thus you cannot barter, sell, or have any of that except for just personal use. I would have to cut all the claws off and actually reattach them somewhere else, so I actually make sure those claws would not be attached, and thus it would not be a lifelike representation. Because Board of Game does allow for some handicrafts to be made from black bears, there is that permitting exception. But I emphasize this, Board of Game can change these regulations. So you always have to go back through and check. Now for the fur bear on the other side, I actually was able to take a full beaver tail itself that's just tanned and be able to stitch it into that area. And that's very much a lifelike representation of a part of the animal, the tail. But because it's a fur bear, I can sell it that way. Now, restrictive use of antlers and such. Now, again, this is one of those distinct aspects where you start talking with degrees of modification. Generally, artists can't buy, sell, or barter horns if it's still attached to the skull. You may possess horns or antlers if they were given to you by someone who salvaged them or removed them from the meat from the field, or if you've already eaten the animal and you've killed itself. So yeah, you can have it personally, but you can't buy somebody else's antlers if they're still attached to the skull. Now, antlers can be used as artistic materials, both antlers and horns. If the antlers are naturally shed and have that nice pedicyle still attached, they may be sold. If the antlers are removed from the skull and transformed into a handicraft, they may be sold as well. The key thing here is the artist may remove caribou antlers from the skull for personal use, but they cannot sell until they've been transformed into a handicraft itself. So this over on here, you can see are two different examples of lifelike representations. One is a caribou figure that is carved out of ivory and has antler that is actually carved to look like antler and is attached onto the ivory sculpture of a caribou. The piece down at the bottom is an example of mine. This is called a lifelike representation there. And you can see it actually is the velvet antlers. The key here is the antlers have not been modified, but there's still a section of the skull attached to those antlers. Now, because there's still a section of skull, I cannot sell or barter anything like that. It's only for my personal use. Despite the fact I was able to carve a beautiful head and be able to mount it on that area, there is still a section of skull attached to that antler. And the fact that the antler itself is used to make a lifelike representation of the caribou, it is considered a trophy, so it cannot be sold. So that was a quick review of degrees of modification and looking at lifelike representations and artistic intent. And as always, when you're looking at trying to go through and make native art, it always helps to go talk with a lot of the land managers. We do actually have a U.S. Fish and Wildlife designated port for CITES, and sometimes it's just good to just go ahead and call the Anchorage facilities and ask, like saying, hey, I'm looking at making some artwork. How much degree of modification do I need if I ever plan to take this outside the state? They have wonderful handouts and such that allow and help with people figuring out whether or not you need a permit. But again, a lot of this also goes in how you're looking at defining it. If it's native art, it has a more broad definition. If you're talking handicrafts, the purpose of handicrafts is looking more towards the commercial, where it really requires that degree of modification. And as always with any of my lectures, I always want to take time to thank all the Native elders that eventually helped me throughout my entire journey here. And I always want to encourage a lot of these new coming up artists to actually go out of their way to make sure that you encourage the new people coming up. So encouraging teaching, letting them learn from your lessons and such. That's how I learned, and it's one of the best ways to actually continue the tradition is working with your Native elders, but also realizing yourself can become a Native elder to help and really train. And again, thank you so much. This was the last lecture series. And as always, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I have a lot of friends with both the state and the federal agencies. So if you have any particular questions, I can always forward them on to those agencies and get back to you on a lot of those detailed questions for making and creating of native arts. Thank you so much for your time, and you guys take care.